right, thanks everyone for being here again. Before I hand it over to them, I'll just explain the approximate timing. So we'll have them speak for roughly 15 minutes each for a total of 30 minutes. Then I'll open up a speakers list where all of you can contribute. Just raise your hand to be added to the speakers list, and then our speakers will conclude at the end with concluding remarks. I'll be using an equity speakers list, which means I may not call on you in the sequence that you raise your hands, but will prioritize Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers. Any questions and or comments are welcome, but please try to stay within 3 minutes, just so that everyone can contribute to the discussion. And also feel free to post on social media, use the hashtag RedOctober2025, and then Spring can be found on all social media platforms at SpringMag.ca. Okay, off to our speakers.
Hey. Thanks so much for coming. This is exciting. Look at the big giant room filled with people ready to talk about workers' councils on Saturday morning. So we got some real sick puppies in the audience, and we love to see that. I only say that because I think about, like, what is the point of a talk like this? What is, and then think about what is the conference, right? Anyone here feel disenfranchised or grumbly or mad about parliamentary democracy anytime? Election results, anyone? Anyone get frustrated that we keep kind of voting for very bad people all the time, and then lots of people don't vote at all, right? It can be a bit frustrating, I suspect. And so I think a talk like this is our attempt to kind of sketch a potential political alternative. And it's based on the premise that, the experience of more than a century of mass struggle offers us some guidelines or some ideas about what alternatives to capitalism and the state as they exist right now could look like. In a bunch of key moments, workers' councils have emerged as a radical extension of democratic control. What's this look like? Well, there's been many revolutionary sort of upheavals or huge mass strikes, things that were revolutions or near revolutions over the last, 130 years. We can think of some like 1917 in Russia, Germany in 1918, Spain in the 30s. We're going to talk about Chile and Iran. Portugal is another example in the 70s, just to name a few. And so in each one of these situations, it created a similar system for the majority in society to make decisions about how to organize the struggle and what priorities to set. And each time democracy revolved around a system of workers' councils. In Russia, for example, this is kind of the big one, workers' councils, they're known as Soviets, developed spontaneously out of the 1905 revolution and the 1917 revolution. They first appeared as elected workplace committees formed to organize over economic issues, but they had to respond to these wider political questions, and that led the councils to make links locally and then regionally. And so it was natural for Soviets that were created in the midst of struggle against the old order to become the basis for workers to exercise their power in a new order. There was a direct connection between those councils, the representation from those workplaces, and the need to decide how to use the wealth produced at those workplaces. And the level of grassroots participation was obvious from the ratio of like Soviets to delegates, right? You had like one delegate for every 500 workers. And so Russia's Soviets were an example of workers' councils, and examples of other workers' councils in other countries have shared common features. And some of those common features make them more democratic than like kind of anything else we know. For instance, immediate recall of the people, the representatives, the delegates or whatever, based on if you're not doing what you're supposed to, we're going to immediately vote you out and we're going to put someone new in, that kind of direct democracy. Paying representatives no more than the people they represent and not allowing them to rise above anyone else's social level. And elections taking place at mass meetings rather than in the isolation of, every few years of a voting booth, right? So the germ of workers' councils can be found wherever labor takes action on its own behalf. However, these full-blown workers' councils are rare, right? Because under normal conditions, even in the best of capitalism, we've got trade unions, right? Which are nice, but their job is to kind of negotiate the conditions of exploitation and not to pose something completely different. Only when class struggle escapes from those kind of limits that's when the usual instruments of control are gone, and you can see these sort of new radical experiments in democracy, right? And which is what we're going to focus on. Workers' councils create the possibility that, so when we think, let's think like different society, different, like a whole different world where we're not producing for profit, workers' councils create the possibility that producers of wealth can have democratic control over what they produce. And it depends on the active commitment of the working class, right? Workers' councils show the potential to form the basis of a different type of society. Imagine producing things for need instead of profit. Maybe we don't need 37 different kinds of the same cereal, you know what I mean? Or like 45 different types of phones and they can break all the time. You know what I mean? Like these kind of things, right? You're imagining that if workers, the people making the stuff that they're also buying, had a say, it could be a little different, right? So I'll focus on Chile. In 1970, you probably heard, folks here might have heard about Salvador Allende, right? Like a very sort of famous socialist figure. In 1970, he won the Chilean presidential election, carried to power sort of on a wave of workers' struggle, right? That was a period of like intense struggle, and the Popular Unity Coalition was what he was heading up. It was made up of 6 parties, the most important of which were the Communist Party of Chile and the Socialist Party, and they sort of dominated the working class movement in Chile. The 1970s were a period of really intense class struggle, and this led to the election of the Popular Unity government. The ordinary people of Chile, of course, were politicized when Allende was elected too, right? Their expectations were high. The PU, Popular Unity's government, their program promised sort of a break with the past, right? They said banks and corporations are going to be expropriated, meaning taken into public ownership without any compensation. And they were going to do the same thing for the large landowning estates too, for rural farming type stuff, right? Allende came first with 37% of the vote, but because he didn't win outright, he kind of had to have his election confirmed. He needed the support of the Christian Democrats, and as a result, he signed something called the Statute of Guarantees. This was ultimately going to prove, bad in the future because it was sort of a promise, like to hold, the levers of power in as they were, right? I'm not going to touch the church, I'm not going to touch the army, and I'm not going to touch the other parts of state power. So Allende's government comes into power. They're starting to implement reforms. Over 1,000 land estates are broken up. Unemployment falls. Manual workers receive a 38% wage increase. White-collar workers receive like a 100% wage increase. He nationalized a lot of companies, mainly those owned by other, capital from other countries like U.S. multinationals. So his reforms didn't touch the Chilean ruling class, right? The whole strategy of Popular Unity was kind of like, okay, we're going to stay within the means of the state, the constitution and stuff. We're going to maintain peace between the ruling and the middle classes and the working class. But the promise of a better world, that kind of people elected him in, gave people the confidence to fight back against bosses themselves, right? So over 1971, the number of strikes increased dramatically. Peasants were confiscating land and stuff like that. And the ruling class of Chile was like, oh, we don't like that. They responded with protests, huge things too, right? Like you had people sending their servants out to bang pots and pans, having them protest in their place. And throughout all of the Allende, and they tried to block nationalization, like the ruling class are trying to block the nationalizations. They're trying to impeach members of the PU government in parliament. And throughout all this, sort of Allende's like, okay, kind of, let's keep it peaceful, guys. Like workers, peasants, like chill. Like let's keep it peaceful. You know what I mean? Don't too much. A participant in one of the shantytown tenant organizations said there was a sharp contradiction, right? The government was telling us that it was our government, but when we marched to the government to ask if we could legalize our occupations, the police would beat us up and trample us. In 1972, the bosses launched this full frontal assault on the Allende government. The transport truck owners, so these are kind of like the bosses of the truck drivers, went on strike themselves. This caused a huge panic. It paralyzed the nation. And the Popular Unity government was kind of paralyzed by this because, of course, their strategy relies on sort of some collaboration between these classes, right? So in the absence of that, what you had was these committees, these neighborhood committees known as like JAPs, these shantytown organizations were formed, and they started to expropriate food from the supermarkets and distribute it themselves, preventing hoarding, ensuring that food was fairly distributed. And these were called like commandos comunales. And in, I'm cringing at my own pronunciation here, Forgiveness, please. But workers, and then in the industrial sector, workers formed these sort of same organizations, but in their workplaces, right? They took over the land and the factories and ran them with the principle of workers' democracy. Production and distribution of goods was discussed collectively, and they started to coordinate between different workplaces, right? You've got regional groups linking up. And they had this program that far outstripped the left-wing parties and certainly the trade unions, right? So amongst other issues, they declared support for Allende's government insofar as it interprets the struggles and mobilizations of the workers. It demands the expropriation of all monopoly firms above a certain limit, of money, or above a certain amount of money. And workers should control all production in all industries, mines, and farms. And that a popular assembly be established to replace the bourgeois parliament. So you can see the kind of this is like 1917 type stuff where these workers' organizations could take over. Now, the usual parties of the working class in Chile kind of reacted negatively to this, right? Like the Communist Party and the Socialist Party are like, oh, don't go in that. Like it's undermining our trade union confederation. Some other parties, like the left of the Socialist Party and the MIR, which is like the party of the radical left, did encourage their members to join, but none of the parties had the strategy of strengthening them as a basis for an alternative to the system that existed. They're just like, oh, these are good things that can pressure everybody to like do better things and kind of stay in the normal lane, as opposed to this is something called, this is like this is a dual power, a challenge to the system as it exists. And I'll just quickly say about that, like the cordones, as they were called, or like the workers' councils in Chile, and the shantytown organizations, these neighborhood committees, formed important elements of what we'd call probably dual power in the revolutionary process. A situation where the working class is confronting the ruling class and moving towards taking over the running of society, but where the ruling class and its state machine have still not been broken. So it's like, you got parliament, you got all these workers and community organizations that are basically running society. They're both existing at the same time, and one of them has to give, right? So how does that get resolved? Well, I think they should, like, if you're going back and you're crystal balling it or whatever, going back there, you'd be like, okay, these should be, we needed like a revolutionary party that has a program that would say these should form the basis of a democratic plan of production and like be an alternative to stuff as it exists. Like these workers' organizations and neighborhood organizations should be running the show, and actually we should be disbanding the parliament, getting a popular assembly and stuff like that. They also needed to begin organizing in the armed forces, establishing rank and file committees of soldiers, sailors, and Air Force personnel with a view to splitting the capitalist class state machine along those lines. And you'd need sort of an organization that had people rooted in these places to make those conversations and win those arguments. Because of course there were people in the army and stuff like that in different places that were sympathetic to this vision. But there just wasn't the organized presence to be able to make that argument and win that debate, right? Instead, what happened, and I'm getting close to a wrap up here, the government worked to appease and reconcile with the ruling class and army. Like in January 73, they produced a bill that said we should return like 100 factories to their former owners. The NDA government kind of incorporated army generals into the government and passed laws allowing the searches and seizure of arms and ammunition from workers' homes and factories, sort of completely disarming the class. Meanwhile, you already had right-wing militias that were kind of untouched and were very well organized. But if you had sort of a revolutionary party with sort of a precise program and the tactics that were rooted in these cordones, to direct that spontaneous energy towards the completion of this revolution and the overthrow of the state machine, you probably have a completely different outcome, right? Instead, what you had is parties trying to funnel the activity of the cordones into the trade union confederations as they existed. You know what I mean? So the popular unity government was kind of caught in a straitjacket. They compromised with the bosses, even though the bosses were going to overthrow them, right? And that same the same army that had been used to shoot down strikers wasn't going to just sit back and let the ruling class. Instead, what you had on September 11th, 1973, Pinochet and the military launched a coup to overthrow Allende. And of course, with the full backing of the U.S. military, the presidential palace bombed, Allende died and the horror that followed, there was over 30,000 people were murdered, thousands more were brutalized, imprisoned, and tortured. And then Pinochet's dictatorship stretched all the way until 1990. So in this case, it is that thing where it's like the old adage that those that make a half revolution dig their own grave was very true in Chile, right? The only thing I think at this point where like there's two different worlds existing at the same time, and one of them has to win. The only thing that could have prevented, I think, the coup was leaning into that power that could have broken the control of the bosses in their state, and that was the power represented by the democratic leadership of the workers' councils. And so I'll end there. Thanks a million.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Peter. That was great. So I'm now going to shift to another historical example that took place around the same time period. The 1979 Iranian Revolution is a really important time in history that a lot of Iranians and leftists alike talk about, but often from pretty different perspectives. So I've been taught about this revolution from a really young age and heard generational stories of the devastating impacts of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But within these narratives, there's often a lot missing regarding the revolutionary moment at the time and what led to this uprising. So I'll be outlining this today, as well as explaining the important developments of the Shora Korgaran, or workers' councils, Shora for short, just meaning council, and how they came to be. So to provide some brief background information, Iran had a 2,500-year-old monarchy, and in 1905 to 6, state power was centralized from individual landowners to the Shah through the Constitutional Revolution, which allowed for engagement in the international capitalist market. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was founded and produced 700 to 800 millions of pounds for Britain up until 1951, while Iran received 105 million pounds during that time period. So you can see how Iran was a vessel for profit for Western capitalist countries. And so during the 1950s, various power struggles took place, and Iran's oil was nationalized following the election of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was eventually overthrown through a CIA-backed coup, which restored power back to the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In 1960, the Shah was spending 40 to 50% of his budget on the military, while 87% of villages did not have a school, 1% had a medical facility, and 80% of the population was illiterate. And in the face of economic crises, there was an increase in strike activity and student protests in which thousands of people were killed. So in response to this crisis, the White Revolution then followed, providing economic and political reforms, such as women's right to vote, profit sharing for industrial workers, health and education services. And this also shifted the economic structure to benefit medium-sized capitalist farmers, which essentially isolated the traditional middle class of the Bazar. So Iran's oil profits led to rapid industrialization, which also led to repressive and violent means of state control and repression through the Savak secret police, as well as a state-run syndicate instead of trade unions, which were essentially controlled by the secret police, and they interfered with elections a lot of times. And so any challenges to the monarchy were often met with murder and torture. And so while the state was modernizing in many ways, it was still characterized again by violence, labor exploitation, and a widening gap between profits and the standard of living for the average person. And so at this time, there were a few leftist opposition groups, namely popular ones were the National Front, representing the traditional middle class of the Bazar owners, and the professional working class, which were often more religious. More leftwards was the Tudeh Party, which was created after the Anglo-Russian takeover and ultimately supported Russian access to oil, which went against the National Front's nationalization efforts. Two other popular groups stemmed from these two, the Mojahedin from the left wing of the National Front, and the Fedayeen, which was a split from the Tudeh Party, also influenced by the left wing of the National Front. And so this period of leftist activity was characterized by guerrilla movements, such as armed operations against banks, police informers, millionaire industrialists, foreign embassies, and police and military buildings, which, while successful in ways, led to their members eventually getting caught by 1975. And during the same time, the Islamic clergy was very responsive to the material needs of the people. Right? They not only offered a sense of community to the urban poor that was driven out of the countryside into cities as a result of this rapid industrialization, but these meetings provided spaces to call for mass protests against the Shah's corruption and against Western interference and imperialist forces more broadly. And so Dr. Shariati in particular spoke to a version of Islam that fought against all, or what they called a, quote, modern Islam, that fought against all forms of oppression, would work towards public ownership of wealth, and Shariati often used the works of Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and Fanon. And so when we look at what they were able to accomplish, the Fedayan and Mujahideen focused their efforts on a small group of revolutionaries carrying out brave acts under the assumption that they would act as what Mariam Poya called, quote, a vanguard that would revive the mass movements through struggle, as opposed to connecting with the daily struggles of the working class and the mass movements that were already taking place, especially within workplaces and among other marginalized peoples, notably ethnic minorities. And so 1977 marked a turning point in Iran's political history, where political action was previously consisted of isolated strikes and protests. There was now sustained public resistance to the Shah's dictatorship. And from 1978 onwards, the demands from these strikes, sit-ins, and protests expanded to include political demands instead of being solely economic, such as the end of martial law, freeing political prisoners, requesting the return of political exiles, removing media censorship, and revoking international oil agreements. And so by September, the workers started to use direct action towards the regime and reduced oil production from 6 million barrels to 1 million barrels a day. And they produced for domestic use only. And so this was done through the support of workers across the country, in particular, customs workers controlled what came in and out of the country. And there was mass demonstrations. Again, with railway workers, they didn't allow police and army officers to travel by train. Communications workers shut down the regime's radio and television for an hour a day. And almost all industries were closed except for gas, telephones, and electricity, which were explicitly stated to serve the public for bare necessities and to continue political activity. So during this time, many of the most important managers and factory owners fled the country, which increased the confidence of the workers, and as a result, elected strike committees took over those responsibilities, such as production limits, the hours of work, and hours of striking. And these essentially became political bodies to replace those syndicates, again, the state-run bodies backed by the secret police instead of unions. And this was possible because of the political moment at the time, right? There was this revolutionary shift happening, mass protests, as well as this newfound power inherited by these committees. And so at this time, there was a deep sense of collective power held by the workers across sectors and oppressed peoples in Iran. And so on January 16th, the Shah left Iran, or fled Iran, I should say, and by February 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini came back to the country and became the head of state and appointed Mehdi Bazargan as the prime minister of the interim government. And so at that time, workers were ordered back to work, and they very quickly realized their working conditions did not change, right? During this time of transition, people were motivated to take power. They were like, we already just had a damn revolution, and our day-to-day hasn't changed. And so they were motivated to take power in manager roles that were absent in some places, and in others, the same managers, supervisors, and secret police representatives remained, which was even more motivation for the shoras to develop. So the pre-revolutionary strike committees often became the core of leadership for the shoras, or workers' councils. And so shoras were, again, like Peter very clearly explained, or workers' council, they were a democratic body of elected delegates that were held accountable and could be recalled at any time. Assemblies were held for debates and decision-making. And so in the shoras, workers were in control of virtually every aspect of the factory's functioning, from hiring to firing, to purchasing materials, to pricing. And there were various committees in charge of different functions, such as the guild committee for trade union demands, financial committees, communications committees to be in contact with other shoras, political committees to create and share political information, guard committees of armed workers, cooperative committees for strike funds, and women's committees. And this ultimately led to increased production, doubling minimum wage, cutting the salaries of those at the top, and most importantly, free milk. And so the shoras ultimately got in the way of the ruling class interests of the newly formed state. And so there were many reasons for their ultimate downfall, which I'll provide brief points for these, but You know, a lot of efforts were first made by the state to identify the shoras as being un-Islamic. It was also difficult to attain raw materials at the time. There was a lack of infrastructure and a need for state-owned machinery as well. And lastly, there was a lack of skilled workers, such as engineers. A lot of people had fled at that point. And so this was the result of capitalism's uneven development in Iran. This both led to the Shah being overthrown and the workers being unable to maintain the means of production. And the shoras had to seek support from the government for funds and skilled labor, which also provided an opportunity for the regime to infiltrate the shoras and their decision-making. So eventually the government developed their police force and used scare tactics during the election, which they won. They then created Islamic shoras to reduce revolutionary influence on workers, and eventually watered this down even further to only granting them a consultative role to have, quote, the creation of a spirit of cooperation and solidarity between all the employees and the management in order to improve and develop the affairs of each unit, which was only open to those who supported the Islamic Republic. Surprise, surprise. And so there was still mass action and pushback at this time by a number of different groups. A number that comes to me too, there was a May Day protest of 1.5 million people, which is just incredible. Namely, there was women, unemployed workers, national minorities. And ultimately, a majority of leftist groups at the time repeatedly undermined the power and momentum of the Iranian working class. They often fell into that trap of socialism from above, which put belief in the Islamic Republic to bring about this revolutionary change, as opposed to encouraging revolutionary self-activity against the state. And while the wider left supported the shoras, they were quite divided in their tactics. Surprise, surprise, shocker. And groups had different strategies. Many had reactionary responses for anti-imperialism, which viewed any other struggles as being bourgeois, right? Or an agent of imperialism, such as women's rights. The Islamic Republic used anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist slogans, which were very enticing. Instead of making efforts to have difficult or controversial conversations among the working class to show how struggles are interconnected, which could have ultimately united the shoras to seek power beyond the workplace and towards the state with the uprising that was happening. They inadvertently, and for some literally, supported the Islamic Republic in consolidating its power, which took place during the American embassy occupation and the Gulf War that came soon after. The shoras lost their power, they lost their many gains, and some members were later arrested and executed. So to conclude this whole talk, the cordones in Chile and the shoras in Iran provide real examples that the working class is able to organize themselves and pose radical alternatives to capitalist democracy during moments of crisis. It's important for us to know this history because it not only shows viable alternatives, but demystifies how this can be possible. We can also learn lessons from the shortcomings of the left during these political moments. We must support when workers take initiatives to expand their power, as opposed to short-sighted goals that discourage real revolutionary. The example of mass action in Chile and Iran points to the importance of socialism from below that, again, accounts for the diverse needs of the whole working class, as opposed to putting our trust in, again, a few select leaders to implement meaningful change. I'm going to end off by a quote I found in my research in a letter written by Yadollah Khosrowshahi, who was a leader of the oil workers' strike against the Shah. He was arrested at the time, and he wrote a letter in 1991 in a message to South African workers. And this is a small snippet of the letter, but he wrote, "Today we have come to realize with 1,000 regrets that the only genuine struggle against imperialism is the unconditional struggle in line with our demands." Thank you.